July 20, 1969. The whole world held its breath watching a silver dot land on the Sea of Tranquility. Through static-filled TV screens, the crackle of radio transmitted a message that shook all of humanity: that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The aura of Apollo 11 was so bright that it dazzled an entire generation. Stars and stripes flags planted on the lunar dust, pure white suits, and the smiles of NASA heroes. It was the pinnacle of the American dream, an absolute victory for freedom and science. But, if you turn off that dazzling light, what will appear in the darkness of the giant rocket launch pads? Let the film roll back. 24 years earlier. 1945. The sky was no longer the bright silver of the moon, but thick with smoke and ash. Berlin collapsed in a long groan of brick rubble. Adolf Hitler's Third Reich was nothing more than a giant graveyard of mad ambitions. Amid the ruins of Nazi Germany, the Iron Eagle's wings were broken, but the brains that created it were not. While military courts were preparing nooses for the perpetrators at Nuremberg, in another dark corner, a bargain with the devil was silently taking place in secret cellars. Here, people did not talk about justice. They talked about blueprints. They did not count bodies. They counted the RPMs of jet engines. And at the center of it all was a name: Wernher von Braun. A black-gloved hand slowly opened a thick file, where bright red SS insignia and crimes at the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp were recorded clearly. But instead of a death sentence, a mundane office supply appeared, a paperclip. Click-clack. The cold metal clip fastened straight into the corner of the file. A small act, a knot of destiny. It didn't just clip papers together, it clipped shut the mouths of witnesses and covered up the dark pasts of hundreds of Nazi scientists. With just a paperclip, a war criminal was suddenly whitewashed to become a national asset of the United States. An exchange of souls for technology began. Welcome to the Noir archive. Tonight, we unfold the files on Operation Paperclip, where lunar glory was built upon mass graves, and the line between genius and demon was as thin as a paperclip. Flickering kerosene lamplight on an oak table at Peenemünde, the Third Reich's top-secret rocket research center on the Baltic coast. At that table, Wernher von Braun, a young man with romantic blonde hair and cold blue eyes, bowed over technical blueprints that were breathtakingly sophisticated. Black ink lines, mathematical specifications precise to the micron, all outlining the form of the A4, also known to the world by a terrifying name, V2. It was the vengeance weapon, the first mechanical wonder of mankind capable of reaching the edge of space. To von Braun, the V2 was not just a rocket, it was a poem in steel, a ladder to lift man out of the Earth's gravity. But, if von Braun's blueprints possessed the beauty of a god, the workshop that created them was a reflection of hell. To realize the dream of flying into space, von Braun needed a place where morality was completely annihilated. That place was Mittelwerk, a massive cave system located deep inside the Kohnstein mountain in the Thuringia region. Here, there was no sunlight, no clean oxygen, only the musty smell of limestone mixed with the scent of machine oil and decomposing death. Under flickering, trembling neon lights, thousands of bone-thin figures in tattered striped clothes moved like zombies. They were prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, those considered untermenschen, subhuman. Their task was to chip stone, carry steel, and assemble the world's most sophisticated electronic brains with bloody hands trembling from hunger. For every whip stroke that came down, a detail of the V2 was completed. For every rocket that left the factory, dozens of lives remained forever in the darkness of the underground tunnels. Wernher von Braun frequently appeared here. Imagine the scene in true noir style. An elegant gentleman in a high-end bespoke suit, wearing a long ash-gray overcoat, walking in polished leather shoes on sodden ground. The clicking of his heels beat a steady, dry rhythm on the stone, drowning out the moans of dying prisoners on the side of the tracks. Von Braun did not stop to dispense compassion. He stepped over curled-up bodies as if stepping over soulless obstacles. His eyes were glued only to propulsion engines, to gyroscopes. To this genius, humans were just another form of fuel to be burned for ambition. Once, when a group of exhausted prisoners collapsed right before the tips of his shoes, von Braun simply stepped around them, adjusted his glasses, and continued debating oxygen liquid pressure with engineers. That coldness was not instinctive cruelty, but a systematic indifference. He had accepted a pact with the devil. Himmler gave him manpower, Hitler gave him a budget, and in return, he gave them the power of destruction from the sky. The V2 was a strange creation. It was the only weapon in human history that killed more people during production than upon explosion. Approximately 12,000 people died under the impact of the V2 in London and Antwerp, but more than 20,000 perished right at the Middelburg factory due to exhaustion, disease, and execution. Every rivet on the rocket's body was a drop of blood. Every weld was a final breath. In the darkness of the Kohnstein mountain cave, the contrast became gruesome. On one side was the pinnacle of physics, the dream of conquering the stars. On the other side was the abyss of savagery, where humans were treated worse than animals. Von Braun understood this very well. He held the rank of SS Major. He knew the origins of these workers. He knew they were dying in the tunnels. But in the Noir mind of one obsessed with a goal, the deaths of several thousand prisoners were just a negligible technical error on the journey to conquer the moon. At night, when returning to his luxurious room, von Braun would immerse himself in the books of Jules Verne. He dreamed of zero-gravity voyages, of the liberation of mankind from the ground. But he forgot that his feet were sinking deep into the black mire of crimes against humanity. The clanging hammers in the dark Middelburg caves were the heartbeats of the V2 project. Without that extreme suffering, there would be no modern rocket science. This is the tragedy of the bloody genius. Von Braun did not build weapons because he wanted to kill, he built them because it was the only way he could touch the sky. This moral compromise was the soul of the Noir style. A charismatic protagonist, an outstanding talent, yet carrying a pitch-black void of conscience. He was the architect of the future, but built that future with bricks from hell. When the first V2S left the launch pad, tearing through the atmosphere with blazing orange fire, von Braun had thought the rocket worked perfectly, except it landed on the wrong planet. A phrase full of irony. He wanted it to land on the moon, but in reality, it was falling onto the heads of innocent civilians in London. And more importantly, it originated from an underground tunnel filled with nameless corpses. The neon lights in the Middelburg tunnel flickered out. Another prisoner just fell. A Nazi engineer made a note in a ledger. And Werner von Braun continued to walk. His polished shoes were not stained with dust, but his soul was forever dyed black by the shadows of Mount Kohnstein. This contrast would never disappear, it would follow him across the ocean to America and hide under fateful paperclips. Germany, April 1945. The roar of Soviet Katyusha rockets echoed from the east like the heartbeat of an approaching nightmare. Amidst the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and collapse, Werner von Braun and his elite team of engineers understood, the Third Reich was dead, but their brains could not die with it. They did not want to fall into the hands of the Red Army, where the price for Nazi crimes could be a bullet to the back of the head or cold mines in Siberia. They needed an exit. And that exit lay to the west, where the ghosts of American intelligence were frantically hunting for a type of treasure that was not gold or silver, but gray matter. This was the moment Operation Paperclip began, one of the darkest political gambits in modern history, where morality was pushed aside to make room for the cold pragmatism of the burgeoning Cold War. In Washington, within the narrow corridors of the Pentagon, a brutal reality was acknowledged: whoever captures the German scientists, owns the sky. U.S. Army generals and agents of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, received a secret order: at all costs, do not let von Braun fall into the hands of the Russians. This haste created a frantic race. U.S. agents penetrated deep into chaotic territory, carrying blacklists but with the purpose of salvation. Imagine a typical meeting in a dilapidated warehouse on the Austrian border. Flashlight beams swept across gaunt faces, yet eyes still flared with arrogance. On one side were OSS agents in neat uniforms, holding Colt 1911 pistols, on the other side were Hitler's top engineers. There were no accusations. No judgment regarding the corpses at Mittelbaudora. Instead, there were contracts. "Do you want to go to America, Herr von Braun?" an agent asked, a half-burned cigarette on his lips trailing hazy smoke that obscured his face. "I want to continue building rockets," von Braun replied, his tone as calm as if he were discussing a standard civilian project. The pragmatism of the US government at this moment reached the pinnacle of irony. President Truman had publicly ordered that no one who had been active in the Nazi Party or a supporter of German militarism be brought into the US. But in reality, almost all the genius brains of the V2 project were Nazi members, even high-ranking SS officers. To bypass the law, US agents conducted a massive whitewashing campaign right on their desks. The name Operation Paperclip was born from this very action. Scientists whose records were too dark, those who directly managed forced labor camps, those who experimented on human bodies would have a paperclip attached to their file. That paperclip was a hidden signal: ignore this part of the past. Create a new background for them. SS party cards were destroyed in roaring fireplaces. Notes on war crimes were replaced by engineering praise. In the blink of an eye, from Hitler's demons, they became victims of the regime forced to work, now ready to dedicate themselves to America's freedom. This haste was not just for a passion for science, but because of the ultimate fear of the rise of the Soviet Union. America needed ballistic missiles. America needed atomic weapons. And they needed them immediately. Justice could wait, but the arms race could not. The transoceanic journey of these goods also carried a strong noir film vibe. Secret cargo ships left the port of Bremerhaven in the dead of night. Hundreds of German scientists were escorted like high-value prisoners, yet enjoyed special food and care. They were not allowed on deck, they had to hide in the dark hold, away from the eyes of the press and the American soldiers just returning from the battlefield, men who might erupt in rage if they knew they were sharing a boat with those who had killed their comrades. When they set foot in Fort Bliss, Texas, or White Sands, New Mexico, the scene became even stranger. Amid the vast desert, new neighbors speaking German began setting up launchpads. They wore cheap civilian clothes bought in America, trying to blend into the American lifestyle, while their minds were still haunted by the ghosts of Peenemünde. In Washington, the paperclip files were hidden in the most tightly locked drawers. US officials knew exactly who they were harboring. They knew about Arthur Rudolph, who had managed the most brutal V2 production line. They knew about Hubertus Strughold, who had conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners. But whenever their conscience stirred, they looked toward the east, where the Soviet Union was doing the same with Operation Soviakim. Fear strangled justice. Werner von Braun, now safe in America, began writing letters home to his family. He delighted in burgers and sprawling highways. In OSS reports, von Braun was described as a charismatic type, highly cooperative. His SS past? It lay within a paperclip somewhere in the basement of the Pentagon. Operation Paperclip was not just an intelligence mission, it was an investment in crime to reap the future. America bought these brains with silence. They sold a part of the soul of the symbol of justice to exchange for superpower status. Secret meetings under dim lights, forged documents, and night trains across the sea created a new reality. In the game of giants, morality was just a negotiable commodity. These Nazi scientists were no longer enemies. They were colleagues. They would soon appear on the pages of Life magazine, smiling like model citizens. But beneath that pristine shell, the paperclip silently remained pinned to the past, a testament to a time when the free world chose to shake hands with darkness to find a way to the stars. Operation Paperclip was a brilliant success in bringing more than 1,600 German scientists into the heart of America. But its true price did not lie in the defense budget, but in a moral hole that America would take many decades to face. Those brains were now ready. Blueprints from Peenemünde were spread across desks in America. A new chapter of human history was about to be written with the ink of compromise, where the paths leading to the moon would begin from the very dark footprints of the past. Leaving behind the damp underground bunkers of Mittelwerk and the torn skies of Berlin, the setting now shifts to Huntsville, Alabama, a quiet southern town originally famous only for its cotton and potato fields. But in the early 1950s, Huntsville suddenly became the center of the world's strangest social experiment. Here, on streets lined with oak trees, local residents began to notice the appearance of new neighbors, tall, well-dressed men who spoke English with thick German accents and had a strange passion for launching massive objects into the sky. This was the astonishment of post-war America. Only a few years prior, these men were arch-enemies, the brains behind the weapons that had devastated London. Now, they stood in line at supermarkets, participated in outdoor barbecues, BBQs, and their children played with American children in parks. The presence of the Paperclip squad in Huntsville created a paradoxical noir atmosphere, a false peace covering the darkest national secrets. Wernher von Braun, the leader of the group, was not just a scientist, he was a master of crowd psychology. He understood that to survive and flourish in America, he needed more than just technical blueprints, he needed public support. With his handsome looks, radiant smile, and charismatic speaking ability, von Braun began a campaign to conquer the hearts and minds of the American people. The biggest turning point came in the mid-50s when von Braun partnered with Walt Disney. In a series of television programs titled Tomorrowland, millions of American families sat glued to their screens to hear this former SS officer explain the future of humanity. He didn't talk about war, he didn't mention the V2 or the deadly underground bunkers. He spoke of wheel-shaped space stations, voyages to Mars, and the dream of conquering the moon. Through the lens of Disney, von Braun was completely reborn. He was no longer a Nazi ghost, but a friendly scientist, an architect of the American future. The pragmatism of the US government at this time brought brilliant results. When the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik 1 satellite in 1957, causing the Sputnik crisis earthquake across the West, America fell into a panic. Who would save the honor of the United States? The answer lay at Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville. Wernher von Braun and his team, who had honed their skills since the V2 era, quickly built the Explorer 1 rocket, putting America's first satellite into orbit in just a few months. From that moment, American pride began to rise strongly, but it was built firmly on the foundation of German technology. What von Braun and his colleagues brought to America was not just knowledge, but a technical thinking system ahead of its time. When NASA was established in 1958, the Paperclip team became the backbone of the Marshall Space Flight Center. Historical data from NASA shows an undeniable truth: without the German scientists, the American space program might have been delayed by decades. From the Redstone rocket, based directly on the V2 design, that took the first American astronaut Alan Shepard into space, to the Jupiter C rocket, all carried the technical genetic code of Peenemünde. But the pinnacle of von Braun's career was the Saturn V, the greatest steel monster ever built by man. At over 110 meters tall with thrust equivalent to tens of millions of horsepower, the Saturn V was the embodiment of the dream von Braun had cherished since childhood. To build it, NASA spent billions of dollars and mobilized thousands of engineers, but the brain coordinating the program was still von Braun. He controlled every detail, from the gyroscopes to the liquid oxygen propulsion systems, technologies he had successfully tested since the 1940s in Germany. 1960s America worshipped von Braun like a saint of science. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine and was highly valued by Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Pride in the fact that an American man was about to set foot on the moon filled the public mind, leaving them without the slightest doubt about the pasts of the people operating that great machine. However, in the depths of the noir style, this glory always came with ghosts. In Huntsville, while von Braun organized classical concerts and discussed Kantian philosophy, the records of his SS past remained silent in top-secret drawers in Washington. The contrast was extreme. On one hand, he was the hero leading America past the Soviet Union in the space race. On the other hand, he was the man who had maximized the brutality of the Nazi regime to accumulate experience for these very successes. One must look at the actual numbers. NASA used more than 1,600 German scientists from Operation Paperclip. People like Arthur Rudolph, who later became the father of the Saturn V system, was the man who directly managed production at the corpse-filled Mittelwerk bunker. Or Hubertus Strughold, who was honored as the father of American space medicine, was the very person who performed horrific pressure and temperature experiments on prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp. The rise of American pride based on German technology is one of the strangest and most ironic chapters in history. The United States won the race to the moon not just with the spirit of freedom, but by absorbing and whitewashing the technical essence of one of the most dictatorial regimes in human history. The Saturn V rockets shining in the skies over Cape Canaveral were essentially giant, perfected versions of the V-2S that had once devastated London. Von Braun achieved something extraordinary. He turned Cold War fear into hope for space. He turned former enemies into elite American citizens. But what was the price of this progress? It was the silence of the national conscience. Americans chose not to look at the paper clips, not to ask about the underground bunkers, as long as they saw the American flag flying on TV screens every time a rocket left the pad. This chapter of history ends in brilliant glory but carries the gray color of compromise. Von Braun reached the moon. He became a symbol of wisdom and vision. However, every cubic meter of fuel burned in the Saturn V engine seemed to carry the echoes of the prisoners who fell in the darkness of the past. The glamour of 1960s NASA was a perfect veil, a sophisticated noir disguise, where the evil of the past was recycled into the miracle of the future. When Apollo 11 left the launch pad in 1969, Wernher von Braun stood there, watching his creation with utter satisfaction. He had achieved his goal. He had defeated gravity, defeated history, and seemingly defeated justice. But history always has its way of reclaiming fairness, and the ghosts he intentionally forgot in Alabama would soon return in belated investigations as the glow began to fade. The 1980s. The brilliant aura of the moon landings had begun to fade in the public memory. America no longer gazed at the sky with pure innocence. Now, eyes began to turn back toward the ground, peering into the dusty, hidden corners of history. In Washington, a special unit was established within the Department of Justice, the Office of Special Investigations, OSI. Their mission was not to build rockets, but to hunt down murderers hiding under the guise of elite American citizens. The darkness that Operation Paperclip tried to bury under paperclips for 40 years began to rise. Secret files from the Peenemünde and Mittelwerk eras were leaked. Holocaust survivors, now gray-haired elders, began to speak out. They did not forget. They did not forget the smell of death in the underground bunkers, and they certainly did not forget the faces of those who watched them die in exchange for the perfection of the V2 engine. The center of this investigative storm was Arthur Rudolph. If Wernher von Braun was the brilliant brain, Rudolph was the executing hand. In America, he was the father of the Saturn V rocket, a recipient of NASA's Distinguished Service Medal. But in OSI records, Rudolph appeared with a different face, the production director at Mittelwerk, the man who directly requested more prisoners from the Dora concentration camp to replace those who had collapsed from exhaustion. The dialogue between them carried an intense noir drama, a confrontation between belated justice and cold denial. Herr Rudolph, the investigator, pushed a photograph of prisoners hanged right at the rocket assembly plant toward him. "You were there. You saw them die." Rudolph looked at the photo, his face unchanging, his grayish-blue eyes cold as tempered steel. I am an engineer. My job was to produce rockets. I am not responsible for how the SS managed prisoners. If I had stopped, I would have been considered a traitor. Silence filled the room. It was a terrifying silence, the kind of silence that had nourished Operation Paperclip for half a century. It was the "I was only following orders" argument, a ghost from the Nuremberg trials returning to the heart of America. Rudolph and his colleagues had chosen glory, chosen the future, and in the process, they had chosen to eliminate their own consciences. They viewed human corpses as merely necessary statistics to achieve Earth's escape velocity. In 1984, a massive shock erupted. Arthur Rudolph accepted the renunciation of his U.S. citizenship and was deported to West Germany to avoid a war crimes trial. The hero of the Apollo program, the man who put Neil Armstrong on the moon, now slunk away from the land of the free in disgrace. But Rudolph was not alone in that darkness. Investigations began to spread to other illustrious names. Hubertus Strughold, the father of space medicine, was exposed for his links to horrific experiments at Dachau, where prisoners were submerged in ice water until death to study hypothermia for German pilots. In America, a large library and many medical awards bore his name. When the truth was revealed, the plagues of honor were removed, but the moral question remained. Is the knowledge that saves American astronauts valid when it was extracted from the ultimate pain of innocent people? The silence of those who knew the truth at NASA and the Pentagon was the most terrifying thing. They knew about von Braun's past. They knew about Rudolph. They knew about the underground bunkers. But they remained silent for the national interest. In the noir world of Cold War politics, justice was a luxury that could be sacrificed for the survival of a superpower. Wernher von Braun passed away in 1977, before this storm of investigation reached its peak. He passed away in glory, buried as a national hero. But for OSI investigators, death was not the end of moral responsibility. They revisited his handwritten letters, the secret reports he had signed as an SS major. They found evidence that von Braun had personally visited the Buchenwald concentration camp to select labor for his production plants. He knew, a former NASA employee exclaimed in a belated interview. We all knew. But we wanted to go to the moon. And he was the only one who could get us there. We chose not to look down at our feet to avoid seeing the blood. The moral debt of Operation Paperclip is not just a debt to the victims of the Nazis, but also a debt to the very ideals of America. A country built on the foundation of freedom accepted borrowing the intellect of the most brutal people to protect that freedom. This cold pragmatism has left a scar that will never heal in the history of modern science. This chapter of history ends with the image of the final Paperclip files being declassified in the 1990s and early 2000s. The light of truth finally shone into the darkest corners, but it also brought a sense of bitterness. Most of the perpetrators died in luxury and were honored. Arthur Rudolph died in Germany, still claiming to be a victim of circumstances. In the dusty offices of the Department of Justice, investigators closed the files. The paperclips had rusted with time, but they remained firmly pinned to the human conscience. They remind us that, every step of scientific progress, without morality as a guide, is only a longer journey into the darkness. The glory of Apollo 11 will forever carry the echoes of the prisoners in the Mittelwerk tunnels, a debt that no space achievement can ever fully repay. Darkness never truly disappears, it just waits there, under the dust of time, to remind us of the true price of power and ambition. Operation Paperclip has ended, but the lesson of the compromise between genius and evil remains, haunting us like a ghost in our history. The files on Operation Paperclip were finally closed, but its aftershocks still echo in the silence of history. Looking back at the entire journey from the deadly bunkers at Mittelwerk to the first steps on the moon, we face a naked and bitter truth. If not for that fateful paperclip, if America had chosen the path of pure justice instead of ruthless pragmatism, would history have been different? Historians agree on one thing: without Wernher von Braun's team, America might have lost decades in conquering space. Neil Armstrong might never have set foot on the moon in 1969, and the arms race might have taken a completely different turn. America bought time with silence. They traded the punishment of crime for the extraordinary progress of science. The legacy of Paperclip lies in the very phone you are holding, in the global GPS system, and in every satellite silently operating in orbit. We are inheriting a modern world built in part by brains that once served destruction. Wernher von Braun once said that science inherently has no morals, it is merely a tool. But the story of his life proves the opposite. Science is always in human hands, and humans are full of compromises. He achieved the dream of touching the stars, but the price paid was his own soul and the purity of a newly formed science. In the noir world, there are no perfect heroes and no pure villains. There are only humans torn by ambition and the times. Operation Paperclip is a long scar on the face of the 20th century. It is a reminder that sometimes, the road to heaven is paved with bricks from hell. We turn off the lights in the office of the Noir archive. The file has been put back into the secret drawer. But every time you look up at the night sky, remember that the twinkling light of spacecraft always carries a hazy gray trail behind it. Because history is not black or white, it only has the gray stains of the paperclip.